Hi and welcome. I'm Jenny. I'm the chaplain for the Equestrian Circle, and I'm really glad you're here because we're starting a new series titled Called. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to explore how God's call works in us and on us and through us. And specifically today, we're going to talk about when things go off the rails. You know, those times in life when you're going along and everything seems to be going great, your plans are working out, and then all of a sudden, there's a roadblock, something happens, and things just fall apart. And your vision for the future is gone. You have no idea what to do next. Well, there's a great 21st century philosopher who gives us some great advice in those times. Her name is Princess Elsa of Arendelle. You may know her from the movies Frozen. She tells us, let it go and venture into the unknown, because even the best laid plans fall apart. It happens. Take Lewis and Clark. You probably heard about these guys somewhere in a history lesson along the way. Well, Lewis and Clark were sent by President Jefferson in the early 1800s to find a waterway that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, because everybody was certain that it had to exist. And so they set out, and they think if they can just get to the source of the Missouri River, that they're going to find a new river, and then they're going to just calmly sail down to the Pacific. But instead of a gentle flowing stream for their canoes, what do they find? Mountains. And not just any mountains, the Rocky Mountains. Their plans fell apart. They had to let it go and venture into the unknown. Well, there are two women, Naomi and Ruth, and they also had their plans fall apart. Now, their story is recorded in the book of Ruth, and it's this great little book. It's right in between Judges and Samuel in the Old Testament. It's a really short story, but it is a tremendous story of total loss and despair, and then coming into eternal hope. Now, we're only going to read the first chapter, part of the first chapter tonight, but I encourage you this week, if you have time, sit down and read this whole beautiful story. But let's start chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her on. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Naomi and Ruth were living their lives with basic assumptions. They lived in a patriarchal society. And so they needed a man. They needed a male relative. Just to have a roof over their head and food on their table and social status and identity, they needed a father, a husband, or a son. Which is what they'd had until first Naomi's husband dies and then both of her sons die. They're hopeless and helpless. And so Naomi hears there's food back in Bethlehem, so she decides to go back there. Now I can just see them, can't you, on the road? They're getting ready to go back to Judah, and all of a sudden it kind of dawns on Naomi. I'm going back empty-handed. I'm going back hoping somebody will take pity on me. And I'm bringing these two other women with me, also widows, but foreigners and Moabites at that. I should just tell them to go back. And so she tells Orpah and Ruth, go back to your home. Because she says, even if I got married tonight, and that's not happening, and even if I had more sons, and that's not happening, you would be too old to have children yourself, and you're not going to wait for them. That's not happening. Naomi was coming from this place where there was no possibility. Nothing could happen. She was bitter, she was lost, and she thought God had forsaken her. Well, just like Lewis and Clark, Naomi and Ruth, their plans for their future, everything they'd seen had fallen apart. Now what? Well, Lewis and Clark had to leave some things behind. Their canoes didn't work real well in the mountains. They had to learn new ways to travel. And they had to leave, most importantly, they had to leave the maps in their head. Everything they had believed about what the future was going to be, about what this territory was going to look like, was totally wrong. So they had to put those maps aside, leave them behind, and venture into the unknown to chart this uncharted territory. Well, like Lewis and Clark, Naomi and Ruth had to leave a few things behind too. Ruth had to leave the place of her birth. She had to leave behind her people. She had to leave behind her gods. Both Naomi and Ruth had to leave behind the belief that their husbands and sons were going to be their security. Both Naomi and Ruth had to leave behind the familiar and venture into these uncharted territories, this unfamiliar territory. And here's a spoiler alert. They do go forth. They do leave behind the life they thought they were going to have in Moab. They do venture into the unknown. And it is an amazing story. Ruth will marry Boaz, and they will give birth to a baby boy named Obed. And you know what that means? That means Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. Yeah, that David, King David. And she's a direct ancestor of Jesus. You can read about her in Matthew 1. Her name gets right there in Matthew's story of how God's plan for salvation started. And Ruth is part of that story. Well, what about us? There are times in our life when our plans fall apart and we have no idea how we're going to move forward. So sometimes we just have to let things go. What do you need to leave behind maybe? Maybe it's a belief about yourself. Those little voices in our head that sometimes say, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not tall enough. I'm not short enough. I'm not big enough. I'm too big. I'm too old. I'm too young. We have to leave those beliefs behind And we have to go into uncharted territory where all kinds of new possibilities exist. Or maybe we need to leave behind other people's expectations. Expectations about who we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do. Because those expectations, they are draining. And we try to live into the image of what they want. We're twisting our soul and our spirit. And it's exhausting. And it's soul destroying. Maybe it's guilt and shame we need to leave behind. Maybe it's something from the past and we're still carrying that baggage around, and the past just weighs us down and doesn't let us live into all of the possibility for the future. Jesus doesn't want us to do that. Jesus says, lay it down. You are forgiven. Let it go. Maybe we need to leave behind comparing ourselves to other people. You are you. You are made in the image of God, the Imago Dei, just the way God planned it. And sometimes when we try to impose our plans on that, we try to compare ourselves and make ourselves into something else, we limit possibility and we actually destroy our own lives and opportunities. Maybe it's a need for certainty that we need to leave. Faith doesn't give us the shortest GPS route from here to heaven. What faith gives us is promises. Promises that God will never leave us and that God will give us hope and a future and that all things will work together for good in God's plan. Jesus called the fishermen to leave their nets. Jesus called Paul to leave persecuting Christians. Jesus called Matthew to leave his tax booth. Jesus called Zacchaeus, leave that tree. Jesus is always calling us to leave behind. Jesus is calling us to leave behind the things that hinder us, the things that hinder possibilities, those maps in our head about the way things should be that limit what could be. When we leave those limiting beliefs behind, we let it go, we leave them in God's hands, and we move into the unknown, we find that God is already there. Think about your life right now. What beliefs, what assumptions, what's holding you back? What do you need to let go? What do you need to leave behind? What are you being called to leave?